Okay, hello, Monument Scholars, my eighth grade scholars. So today I'm going to be going over um, this article this is the first one. It should be right on top of your packet, and the title is "The Little Rock Nine Students Are a Permanent Part of U.S. History." So, as you know, we did a lot of pre-reading of Jim Crow. Um, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, looking at the social and racial climate of the 1950s, leading up to the Little Rock Nine and the integration of Central Rock High School. And so, to prepare us to read the memoir of one of the Little Rock Nine, Carlotta Walls Lanier. And so, in that, we're just going to continue in our reading and research of the Little Rock Nine. So, all four of the articles that you received were about the Little Rock Nine, and probably shared the same information across different platforms, but in very different ways. And so the purpose of this is to give you a better picture of what Carlotta, who was the youngest of the Little Rock Nine, and her peers went through when they decided and were chosen to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So, in doing that, in conjunction with our reading of A Mighty Long Way, we are going to read these articles, and these were specifically picked out for you, especially as we were initially going on break from the coronavirus, which we thought initially was maybe going to be 2 weeks, that has now turned into about 2 months. So, I am just going over the articles because I know a lot of times we are able to have that face to face time in class where we can like ask questions and, popcorn read together, get a better understanding of our reading. And so, I'm going to read them aloud, and I will probably take breaks after each heading so that we can maybe talk about what we read. If I feel like it may be something that we probably need to touch on, especially when it comes to answering the text dependent questions at the end, the four multiple choice questions. Okay, so this came from Newsella, a resource that we use often in our ELA class to help us with our reading fluency, reading comprehension, and with our questions citing textual evidence. So I'll start reading. This was taken from the Smithsonian, and um, the image here is one of the first African American students at New Lincoln High School in New York City, sits next to fellow student Kathy Robinson. And so this is just a picture, a visual. Yep. All right, so I'll start reading. When she was about 15, about to attend Little Rock High School, Minnie Jean Brown envisioned making friends, going to dances, and singing in the chorus. The year was 1957, and Minnie Jean was one of the first 9 African American students to go to the school. Her fantasy quickly evaporated. She was soon ridiculed and physically battered. On what was to be her first day, she faced the horror of soldiers blocking the entrance to the building and an angry white mob encircling the school. So we had talked about how the president at that time decided to send the Coast Guard down. So when they integrated, that's what they walked into was the Coast Guard military there to help to stand at the border of this process. So telling the segregation story, that's the next heading. In 2015, that once scared and excited teenager, whose name is now Minnie Jean Brown Trickey donated more than 20 personal items to the National Museum of American History. She gave school items, including a notice of suspension and the dress she designed for her high school graduation. It all went on display in the American Stories gallery at the museum. She hoped to help the story of the Little Rock Nine as she and her fellow African American students at Central High came to be known. None of these teenagers were particularly political, and all were looking for wider opportunities. Still, they were thrust into the spotlight of the growing civil rights movement. They were a part of one of the most dangerous and dramatic school desegregation efforts in the country. Segregation was the practice of separating people based on race. This was wrong, but it was allowed by the law in the United States until the 1960s. In segregated areas, black students had to attend blacks only schools and white students had to attend whites only schools. It was allowed because supporters of segregation claimed that the schools were separate but equal. However, in truth, they never were equal. At a certain point, I didn't know if I would be alive to graduate from high school or be stark, raving insane, or deeply wounded, Tricky says. Remember we talked about, um, some of the reasons why the schools weren't equal, right? So in the first two chapters of A Mighty Long Way, Carlotta talks about her experience of going to visit her cousin in New York, and how different that experience was of being able to play with classmates or her peers of different ethnicities and races, out in the public and at parks, and that she just didn't experience that same type of covert racism that she experienced when she got back to Little Rock, which was considered the South. And so, especially coming, from New York compared to New York. And so she talked about in chapter 2 how she was able to see Central High get built because it was only a mile from her school, and it was a shorter distance than it was to the black school she went to and a little further away. And she talked about how, millions of dollars went into building Central High School. Um, and, when white schools got new books or new resources, then the black schools got the hand-me-downs, right? So that was just kind of one example of showing how there wasn't any equality or equity in their schools because they weren't on the same playing field. They weren't given the same resources. They weren't given the same amount of money that was allocated to help fund them. They weren't given the same experiences in their classrooms, in their schools. For example, Carlotta mentioned that Central High School had a new state-of-the-art gym and theater for those who wanted to study theater, who it was important for them to play sports. And at her black high school further across tracks, they didn't have those same resources in their school. They didn't have a state of the art theater. They didn't have a new gym. They didn't have a brand new stadium that they built for the football team. And so those are just other examples that Carlotta showed and told us about in chapter 2 of A Mighty Long Way of some of the inequalities that black and white schools face. And of course, coming out of Jim Crow, what we know to be like those kind of hidden racist laws and practices, more so that they practice, especially in the South, and how that affected, how they went to school and even went to church and the neighborhoods they lived in and who they were allowed to speak to and be friends with. So that's just kind of a little more to that. Okay, I'm moving on to the next heading is student excitement turns to fear. Minnie Jean Brown was the eldest of 4 children. A native of Little Rock, she attended segregated schools. She started senior high school as a 10th grader in 1956 at the newly opened Horace Mann School for African Americans. It was across town from where she lived and offered no bus service. The important 1954 U.S. Supreme Court decision, known as Brown v. Board of Education, banned segregated schools, one for white students, one for black students. Minnie Jean heard an announcement at school about enrolling at Central, which was an all-white school, and decided to sign up. About 80 African American students had been approved by the Little Rock School Board to transfer to Central the following year. Then the number dwindled to 10. This came after the students were told they could not participate in extracurricular activities, their parents were in danger of losing their jobs, and there was a clear threat of violence. After the challenges of the first day, the 10 became 9. Tricky says her real motivation for attending Central was that it was just 9 blocks from her house. She and her 2 best friends would be able to walk there. I really thought that if we went to school together, the white kids are going to be like me, curious and thoughtful, and we can just cut all the segregation stuff out, she recalls. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Excuse me. Right, we Carlotta talks about that in chapter 2 as well, about there were some that the Sears organization, the company, Sears Holding Company, and Rockefeller and a few others had put in a couple, tens of thousands of dollars to help build up black schools across the country. And Little Rock was one of those places where they had built some new schools, and Horace Mann happens to be one of those at the time. And Carlotta kind of talks about that and how, even like Minnie Jean mentioned here, is that Central was still closer, and still, a more attractive place to attend school because of what it had to offer and its proximity to her home. I had a sense of failure. Moving on to the third heading. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus called in the National Guard to keep the African American students from entering Central. When the 9 students did get into the building a few weeks later, a riot broke out and they had to escape in police cars. They were not able to enroll until 2 days later, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent in 1,200 soldiers, so that's 1,200 soldiers, to defend the students and disperse the protesters. So in the beginning, when Minnie Jean talks about facing soldiers, these were the soldiers that the president, as I mentioned, had to send down. So initially, the very racist governor of Arkansas at the time had sent in the Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard wasn't actually there to protect the 9, Little Rock 9. They were really there to keep them out because he himself was racist and didn't necessarily agree with them integrating Central High. And so the president, saw this unfold and decided to send in these soldiers to protect them so that they'd be able to enter into the building. Although troops remained at Central High School throughout the school year, the Little Rock 9 faced verbal and physical assaults every day. The African American students were never placed in classes with each other, so they could not discuss their torment. Minnie Jean had cafeteria food spilled on her 3 separate times, but none of her white abusers ever seemed to get punished. So, that's really interesting, right? That how intentional, this the act of racism was, that they didn't even allow them to have classes with each other, which, we can assume and imply, we can infer that they didn't want them to create a bond while they were there. They wanted to continue to make them feel like they were an outcast, like they were different, like they didn't belong there, right? Because the white majority didn't feel that they belonged there. So, they went as far as to not even allow them to take classes together, to continue to try to kind of divide and conquer, if you will, divide them, to not even give them even a piece of friendship and hope and, sameness that they, might, that relatability that they probably would have with their black peers. Okay. In December 1957, I'm at the third paragraph. In December of 1957, she dropped chili on the heads of two boys in the cafeteria who were taunting and knocking into her. She was suspended for 6 days. That school notice that school notice is now part of the Smithsonian collection. Then, in February 1958, Tricky verbally responded to some jeering girls who had hit her in the head with the purse. That incident caused Tricky to be expelled from Central High School. I had a sense of failure that lasted for decades over that, Tricky says. After she left Central, white students held printed signs that said, "One down, eight to go." Um, so, there, we hear about Minnie Jean being, verbally and even physically abused and assaulted um, because of the, racist times, even though she's the victim, she gets in trouble. She gets suspended and eventually expelled, which is, more severe than a suspension. And getting expelled and an expulsion from school means that you can no longer attend the school. It's not like a suspension where you may get like it's a short term stop, right? You get suspended for maybe 3 or 5 or 10 days. This was she got expelled, which means it wasn't a temporary stop. It was you can no longer attend Central High School. So leaving Central was a new beginning. I'm at the next heading. Following her dismissal, Tricky was invited to New York City to live in the home of doctors Kenneth and Mamie Clark. They were African American psychologists who had conducted research that exposed the negative effects of segregation on the minds of African American children. While living with the Clarks, Tricky attended the art focused New Lincoln School to finish out her 11th and 12th grade years. My classmates at New Lincoln allowed me to be the girl that I should have been, she says. At the end of her stay, the Clarks wanted to give her a gift. They settled on a graduation dress. It was a perfect fit, and I felt perfectly beautiful in it. Tricky remembers. There was a photo of me with my shoulders up, and I have this big smile, and I have this real feeling of relief, she says. I'm at the next heading. A real understanding for her role. Tricky went on to attend Southern Illinois University to journalism. In 1967, she married Roy Tricky, a biologist, and they had 6 children. The family moved to Canada to protest the Vietnam War, and she earned both a bachelor's and a master's degree in social work. Later in her career, Tricky returned to the United States and served in President Bill Clinton's government. Now she works as an activist on behalf of peacemaking, youth leadership, the environment, and many other social justice issues. According to her daughter, Spirit, it took nearly 30 years before Tricky revealed to her children her role in the civil rights movement. Wow. Eventually, documentaries and books were released about the incidents. Spirit and her siblings began to understand that what their mother had gone through. Um, Also, the Little Rock Nine started to be recognized for their contribution to desegregation. In 1996, 7 of them appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show. They made peace. Excuse me. They made peace. My fingers are not cooperating. With some of the white students who had tormented them. President Clinton awarded each of them the Congressional Gold Medal in 1999. Individual statues of the Little Rock Nine were placed outside the Arkansas Capitol in 2005. Wow. So I said, wow. I wanted to come back to that. I said, wow. She said it took her 30 years to even tell her children that she was even a part of this movement. And I think that's really interesting. And I would probably assume that, what she may have endured at that process of the integrating Central High School and the abuse that she endured was probably too painful for her to maybe talk about. I don't know. I'm just assuming by, inferring from what she described her experience to be that perhaps maybe a reason why it took her so long to even mention about her being a part of this movement, um, because it may have just been, too hard or too painful to talk about or live or, to think about. That's Miss Garman's assumption. So becoming a part of history. I'm at the last heading. Tricky believes that she will be trying to understand the events of her high school years for the rest of her life. One truth that she now sees is that many of her white classmates had been taught to hate. We couldn't expect the white kids at Central High to go against what they had learned their whole lives, she said. Through articles she read about her white classmates, Tricky discovered that she, in particular, angered them because they said she walked the halls of Central like she belonged there. In 2015, when Tricky delivered her Little Rock Nine object to the Smithsonian, people filled the room to hear her oral story. She described that afternoon in 1957 as a day that she will never forget. The desegregation pioneer was assured that her story would be preserved for future generations, not as African American history, but as American history. So, what really stood out to me in that last section was her saying, a few things. One, we couldn't expect the white kids at Central High to go against what they had learned their whole lives. So, she comes into adulthood, and experiences life, um, as a black woman, and navigates that space to, and it takes her up and through adulthood to realize that, hate is something that's learned, right? And because they were taught to hate and they were taught to be racist, and that's all they know, she's saying that it's unrealistic for her or for them to have expected them to act or behave any differently because the only thing they knew was to hate them. The only thing they knew was, to be racist and mean and evil towards them because that's what they were taught. They were taught that they didn't belong there. They were taught that, stereotypes of black people, and so because that's um, all they knew, that's what they did, that's what they showed. And so she, is saying there that how could I expect them to be nice to me when they don't even know what that means, what that looks like or feels like, because they've been taught explicitly not to be nice to me. I'm not worthy of that niceness. Okay. And so again, I think we talked, or I mentioned earlier, about, feeling of belonging. And so it's interesting that she says here, that she discovered in particular that she discovered that she angered them, her white classmates. And one of them said she walked the halls of Central like she belonged there. Um, Bearing in mind when they integrated Central High School, it was 3 years after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling that schools were no longer, that schools were no longer to be segregated. It was no longer constitutional or, lawful for schools to be segregated. So, of course, they were making history by integrating, but legally they had the right to do so. So, that kind of goes back to the teachings that many white Americans had during that time, that you didn't belong in their spaces. And that, kind of goes even further back when we talked about Jim Crow. That's how they moved, right? Those were the practices. That's how they practiced these things as if you didn't belong. You didn't belong, at my water fountain. You didn't belong in my school. You didn't belong in my church. You didn't belong in my neighborhood. You don't belong in my grocery store. You don't, belong for your child to play with my child. That sense of entitlement and superiority. That's, we kind of talked about that when we went through the history of Jim Crow and racism and classism and kind of looking at all of these isms as a system, right? Okay, I know that's a lot. So you have your 4 multiple choice questions, and I'm almost done. And I'm so proud of you already for watching this 30-minute video, even though we're only at 24 minutes now, but you might inch it to 30 once we go through these questions. But you're also so amazing and attentive during class, so I know that this will be a cakewalk for you, right? Okay, so number 1 says, read the list of sentences from the article. The year was 1957, and Minnie Jean was one of the first 9 African American students to go to the school. That's one. The second sentence says, this came after the students were told they could not participate in extracurricular activities. Their parents were in danger of losing their jobs, and there was a clear threat of violence. When the 9 students did get into the building a few weeks later, a riot broke out, and they had to escape in police cars. The African American students were never placed in classes with with each other, so they could not discuss their torment. So the question asks, which 2 sentences taken together provide the best evidence to support the idea that the Little Rock Nine were risking their safety by going to Central? Okay, so it's asking which 2 sentences. So we already know that out of the 4 sentences, 2 of them together provide the best evidence to support the idea that the Little Rock Nine were risking their safety by going to Central. So, because you have it in front of you, you can read the sentences aloud. So, A has sentence 1 and 2. B has sentences 2 and 3. C, sentences 3 and 4. D, sentences 1 and 4. So it's going to be one of those options, but it's asking you which 2 sentences taken together provide the best evidence to support the idea that the Little Rock Nine were risking their safety by going to Central. I'm going to pause to give you a moment to read over those options and choose the best one. I should get my Jeopardy music. Is that enough? I know. I get on your nerves, and I'm okay with that. I can live with that. I'm at peace. So we're moving on to number 2, and I'll come back to the answers. So number 2, which section of the article best explains why Tricky left Central High School? Okay, so the best way to answer a question like this, right, is let's read our options and then we can kind of go back. Okay, so which sections of the article section singular section. Which section of the article best explains why Tricky left Central High School? A, student excitement turns to fear. B, I had a sense of failure. C, leaving Central was a new beginning. D, a real understanding for her role. So when it's saying here, which section of the article best explains why Tricky left Central High School? So if you look at go back through your article real quickly and you'll see that the sections are bolded, right? And there's another section. Okay. And section here, section there. So all of the sections are bolded, okay, to help you kind of find them more easily. So it's asking which section of the article best explains why Tricky left Central High School. So out of those 4 choices, which section best, explains why Tricky left? Right? Did she leave because the student excitement turns to fear? That's A. B, I had a sense of failure. That section. Does that best explain it? Leaving Central was a new beginning. Is that the best section? Or a real understanding for her role? Which section? And understanding that section, you may have to skim back through to kind of see what's in that section. If the title doesn't help hint you enough, give you enough hint of what it may be, then you may have to skim through that section to see if the explanation in that section best helps explain why Tricky left Central High School. Okay, I'm going to give you another few seconds to go back and look so that you can make your best choice. And then we'll come back to it. I'm going to irritate you with my Jeopardy. Do, 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 do. That's all you get. Okay, number 3. Which of the following best explains how being one of the Little Rock 9 affected Tricky? Okay, let's read that again. So which of the following options, A through D, which best explains how being one of the Little Rock 9 affected Tricky? So real quickly, when we see best, right? Like a lot of times, when you see the word, when it's asking for the best one, sometimes it can get tricky because some of the options, may kind of answer the question or may be, may make sense, but it's asking you to make the best one, which does the best job of answering the question. So when you see, which of the following best, and you'll see, as you already know because you have it with you, is that best is always in all caps. Oh, dang it. Without giving you the answers. Good job, Miss G. But see, y'all be paying attention, so you ain't even get it. But the best it just wants to know which one out of these options, which one does the best job of answering the question or explaining, what it is that you're trying to find out. Okay, so which of the following best explains how being one of the Little Rock 9 affected Tricky? And I'll read all of them. A, it caused her to become a television journalist, which led to creating many documentaries and books about the events. So we're looking at which of these best explains how being one Little Rock 9 affected her life. That's what we're looking for. That was so A again is it caused her to become a television journalist, which led to creating many documentaries and books about the events. B, it caused her to become a social worker and teacher herself so that she could teach social justice at Southern Illinois University. C, it caused her to feel anger due to the bullying by her classmates and to write newspaper articles about what they did. D, it caused her to feel shame and frustration about her high school years, but also to have the chance to live and go to school in New York. So which of the following best explains how being one of the Little Rock 9, how it affected her? How did it affect Tricky? Which best explains? Okay. Do, 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 do. I go a little slow. Do, do, do. Do, 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 do. This is a little tricky, so I'll keep going. Do, 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 I like getting on your nerves. You and you love me. You love me for it. Okay. Number 4. According to the article, why did Tricky agree to donate her items to the National Museum of American History? According to the article, so you're finding evidence. According to the article, why did Tricky agree to donate her items to the National Museum of American History? Okay. A, she wanted to help preserve the story of the students who are part of the Little Rock 9. B, she wanted to prove to her daughter that she really was one of the Little Rock 9 students. C, she wanted to thank the state of Arkansas for creating a statue of the Little Rock 9. D, she wanted to explain to her classmates that she did not want to be one of the Little Rock 9. So, according to the article, why did Tricky agree to donate her items to the National Museum of American History? So, um, you have to go and find the evidence, right? According to the article, so you have to go and find, you know, why did she agree to donate her items to the National Museum of American History? Okay. Was it A, she wanted to help preserve the story of the students who were part of the Little Rock Nine? B, she wanted to prove to her daughter that she really was one of the Little Rock Nine students. C, she wanted to thank the state of Arkansas for creating a statue of the Little Rock Nine. Or D, she wanted to explain to her classmates that she did not want to be one of the Little Rock Nine. What do you think it is? So take a moment to go back if you need to, and to try to find the evidence in the article. And find the reason of why she agreed to donate her items to the National Museum of American History. I won't give you a hint. Actually, I will give you a hint. Sometimes it's helpful when you're reading a story, especially a story that has headings, or sections, as aforementioned. Sometimes sections can help, lead you to what's going to be in that section of a text. Um, so I'll give you about 30 more seconds, and then we'll go over them together, and then we will dismiss. Okay? Yeah. Now it's like in my head now. It's not even now it's in my head. It's okay. I'm gonna come ready next time because y'all know how I did in class that day. I had it ready on my phone, so I'm gonna do it. I gotta get it back on YouTube. All right, we're ready. Ready or not? Because here I go. All right. So, number one, you were to read the list of sentences from the article, and you were to choose which two sentences taken together provide the best evidence to support the idea that the Little Rock Nine were risking their safety by going to Central. Um, if you chose B, sentences 2 and 3, you are correct. Okay, I'll read the two sentences. Sentences 2 and 3 say, this came after the students were told they could not participate in extracurricular activities, their parents were in danger of losing their jobs, and there was a clear threat of violence. When the 9 students did get into the building a few weeks later, a riot broke out and they had to escape in police cars. Right? So that talks about them, fearing they're risking their safety. Their parents may lose their jobs. They were threatened with physical and verbal violence. Excuse me, they were bullied and not allowed to participate in extracurricular activities. Um, and a few weeks into integrating, a riot broke out, and they had to escape in police cars, police escorts. So those are the two best sentences that help, that support the idea that they were risking their safety by going and integrating Central High School. Okay, so number two. Which section of the article best explains why Tricky left Central High School? Okay. If you answered B, I had a sense of failure, you'd be correct. Right? So the other ones aren't the best, because if you in this section I had a sense of failure. If you go back into the text, that she talks about the abuse that she endured that led to her two suspensions and led to her expulsion. And she talked about how being expelled. Remember, I talked about the difference between a suspension and expulsion. Not being able to attend anymore, she felt like she failed. Being a Little Rock Nine. Being able to be. one to help to integrate that to follow through with the process, and she felt like she felt that, and I hate that she felt that, given the circumstances, but that is why she left, right? Because she got because of the abuse she endured that led to her being suspended and expelled, um, and so she in that section, inside that section, the text inside that section helps explain, best explains why she left Central High School. Okay, number 3. So, which of the following best explains how being one of the Little Rock Nine affected Tricky? So, we're looking at which one best explains how it affected her. Okay. If you answered D, you'd be correct. It caused her to feel shame and frustration about her high school years, but also to have the chance to live and go to school in New York. Out of the options given, that best explains how being one of the Little Rock Nine affected her. Right? She felt shame in being suspended and expelled, and her experience, what she went through, not being able to see it through, but it did give her the opportunity to go with the doctors, the two black psychologists in New York, where she ended up attending the Lincoln school there, um, and so that was the best option to explain how it affected her out of the options given. Okay. According to the article, I'm on number 4, the last one. According to the article, why did Tricky agree to donate her items to the National Museum of American History? Okay. If you answered A, she wanted to help preserve the story of the student who were part of the Little Rock Nine, you'd be correct. And as the hint that I gave you before, you will find this in the section becoming a part of history. And the very last sentence in that section says the desegregation pioneer was assured that her story would be preserved for future generations, not as African American history, but as American history. So it explicitly states right in this section, becoming a part of history, right? That's a hint that we might be talking about history, which it asks here about the Museum of History, explicitly explains her reason. And so the best option here was A, and she wanted to preserve the story of the students who are part of the Little Rock Nine. And that's why she decided to donate her things to the National Museum of American History. Okay, I hope that reading the Little Rock Nine students are a permanent part of U.S. history article was helpful for you today. I didn't know that it was going to take this long, so hopefully you will see this to the end. And hopefully this was helpful for you. So let me know. You can comment once I post it in Google Classroom and you take the time to watch it, because now you have time. Hopefully, maybe, to do so. You'll be able to let me know what worked for you, what didn't. Was it helpful for me to explain certain sections? Did you think Ms. Garman talked too much? What you do and didn't like about it? Because this is all new for us. We've not had to charter these territories of doing these videos. So I'm still trying to find my way too of what works well and what doesn't. So I'm open to your feedback to see how this worked for you. Okay. So hopefully this was helpful for you in kind of breaking this article down. And I know the Lexile was maybe pretty okay for you. For some of you, it might be a little difficult for others, and that's okay. So I just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to kind of break this down. If you want to see this done a different way, just let me know and we can talk about what that may look like in the future. But hopefully this was helpful to you, and hopefully you got some clarity in your reading and breaking down your answer choices. Okay, I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, morning, afternoon, whenever it is that you decide to watch this. And I look forward to reading the next article with you. So the next one that I'm going to dissect is going to be Integration of Central High School. That's the second Newsella article that you have. And that looks like this. So that's the next one that I'm going to read, and I'm going to upload that tomorrow. Okay, so I hope you have a great day. I hope this was helpful. Please make sure you give me your feedback and enjoy your um, afternoon, day, evening, morning. Okay, great.